My name is Tom Palmer, and I've been working for liberty for a long time, and it's my passion, it's what I do, it's what I think about when I wake up in the morning and when I go to bed at night. So that's really the core of my life, has been the struggle for human freedom. And also learning in the process, learning more and more about the libertarian ideas, their application, the good responses, the other ideas, and so on. I have a great advantage in that what I do tends to be quite varied. Sometimes I yearn for a life of predictability where I'm going to do the same thing every day, but I never get that. So I travel a lot. I'm on the road constantly, which isn't as fun as it might sound. You get to go to wonderful places, but it means airport to university to debate to radio station to hotel, back to airport, and so on. But I get in the process, even if I don't get to see all the great museums, I get to meet really inspiring people who are working for freedom in so many different contexts, under totalitarian or authoritarian governments, under much freer societies, all across the world, every religion, every race of humans, every ethnicity, and that love of freedom is present in all of them. I would say that the liberty movement, we say libertarian, but it has different names in different languages and different places, is better equipped, better prepared, and better connected than at any time in human history. So I'm very optimistic about that. At the same time, we see threats on the horizon that we didn't see in the past. The re-emergence of forms of collectivism we thought were dead in 1945, of National Socialism and fascism in various guises re-emerging around the world. And then the emergence of several states that are actively hostile to libertarian or classical liberal ideas. So in the Kremlin, certainly in Beijing, and you could list some others as well, that are combating libertarianism, and they see our views as the enemy. And any kind of illiberalism, left wing, right wing, they don't care, is preferable to freedom. So that's something we haven't seen since the end of the Cold War, and it's just begun to emerge now in a very strong way. And then finally, a threat that I don't think we've really come to grips with yet, of a new kind of totalitarian state that makes the ideas of George Orwell seem modest and humble. The total surveillance state that is being pioneered in Beijing by Xi Jinping and the Communist Party leadership. Complete surveillance of everything, your electronic life, your physical life in the world, where you go, facial recognition technology, artificial intelligence, cameras everywhere that can recognize not just your face, but how you walk. And then the social credit system, which will create a rain of micro incentives, negative and positive, to mold the population to be subservient, to be obedient slaves of the state. I think this is really quite scary, and we need to be prepared to respond to that and to defend liberty against a new kind of enemy that is using technologies that were undreamt of even 25 or 30 years ago. It is my hope, but not my prediction, that the utter stupidities and ignorance of protectionism will be effectively refuted in practice and in discourse or speech or theory. The basis of the current trade policy, if we want to call it that, of the Trump administration is so backward, so uneducated, so ignorant, and authentically so stupid that I hope we will be able to be rid of it for some time. But stupid ideas have a way of coming back. We thought that we had refuted those some years ago. I think we did, but they resurface. Partly because it's hard for people to understand that the world is not exclusively a zero-sum game. It's natural for people to think, if you gain, I must have lost. And that is the foundation for Trump's trade policy, is a zero-sum worldview. They don't understand there are two other kinds of games. There's the positive-sum game, and that's the game in which we both benefit. The sum of the benefits is greater than zero. Exchange, trade, is about positive-sum games because both benefit. That's why when you buy something at a store, you say thank you, and the merchant says thank you, which is kind of weird when you think about it. They're both benefiting. There's another kind of game, which is where protectionism leads us, and that's the negative-sum game, in which the sum of the benefits is less than zero. It causes more harm than any benefit that anyone might receive from it. That's also possible, and we've seen that over and over and over again. As countries adopt protectionism, it's a catastrophe for them. And I should add, it is normally the prelude to war. I hope that protectionism will be no longer dominant as it is today in 10 years, that we will drive a stake through its heart and bury it. Be more influential than me, that's the number one thing. One of the reasons why I'm such a strong supporter of Students for Liberty, I give my money to Students for Liberty. Every month, money goes out of my bank account. At the end of the year, I send more money that I can afford because I want them to do a better job than my generation has done. And I trust and believe that they will. In order to do that, it means becoming more knowledgeable, so that's self-cultivation. Learn more, read widely, not just in some little narrow area. And read the ideas of anti-libertarians. That's also very important. Understand their arguments. Why do they not agree with us? Try to see why and come up with good responses. And in doing that, have an open mind. Maybe they have a good point, and we should be open to it. And then become better at explaining the simple system of natural liberty, as Adam Smith put it. Explaining that to people and showing them the benefits of it and the morality and the goodness and the justice and how it makes the world better to accord to other people their freedom. So those are the things that I think are the most important. Cultivate yourself, and then cultivate your ability to convince others. And that means engaging. It's not propaganda only and slogans and things like that. It means actually engaging with people and taking them seriously, trying to understand why they don't agree with you, and then give a reasoned response to them. I think that's the ticket to success. The most important decisions. Well, there was one that was something that I realized quite a few years ago, and that is that I didn't have the desires and the personality to be a professor. I like being in motion. I don't like to be in the same place for a long time. And so I made a decision, although I went on, got academic degrees and finished my doctorate and all that. I didn't want to be in one place for a long period of time. And I'm not disparaging that. There's great satisfaction in that, to teach and to work with generation after generation of students, but not for me. And I decided that I wanted to be more in the field and more active. And I also learned something else about myself. By and large, I realized I'm not afraid of other people. And so I would go to places other people didn't want to go, to Afghanistan and to war zones, to find people struggling for peace in the most difficult places, people who want to live in societies of mutual dignity and respect in various countries. I did that in the Soviet Union and smuggled books and photocopying machines, and it wasn't a great risk to me. My friends were the ones taking the big risks of imprisonment or maybe worse in some cases. But I realized that I can do that. It brought me great satisfaction in life, and friendships that I made that have been with me now for 35 years, and getting to work with really admirable, noble people, libertarians working in the most unusual or unpredictable places in Afghanistan, in the Soviet Union and other communist countries. And those people lent to me the stamina to keep doing it. And so that's a decision I made, was what would make me happy. I wasn't going to go down the route that many of my friends had gone, and God bless them, they're happy. But I tried to do the thing that was suitable for me. And being a libertarian activist, that was it. I've been really pleased to see the growth of the liberty movement in India and Pakistan and surrounding countries. There are a few things that people who aren't there, don't quite get. India isn't just a country, it's a whole world. It's huge, and it has so many languages and so many different traditions and cultures within it. So it's not just like another country or another state or place like that. It's a whole civilization in a way. And to see the liberty movement growing so rapidly in that area is really exciting to me. When Parth Shah returned to India to set up the Center for Civil Society, which has been very helpful to the liberty movement, he thought he would do something like the Cato Institute, put out studies, and he realized he didn't have the people to do that. He had to find them and train them. So most of the staff of that organization went to the summer schools that they began organizing liberty and society, similar to Institute for Humane Studies programs. And out of that group, they then recruited the people who became scholars and writers and researchers and so on. And then, some years later, Students for Liberty arrives on the scene. And this is a godsend, because it energized so many young people. They have such a wonderful, positive culture. Peace, love, and liberty. And those are taken seriously. So that there are Muslims and Hindus and Jains and Buddhists and Christians and Jews, non-believers, and they're all friends together because they share a passion for liberty. And they make a point of reaching to their friends in Pakistan and other countries, despite the problems between India and Pakistan, and saying, these are our friends. This has been really powerful and has really helped to spread the ideas of liberty through India. And then the connection with the Indian tradition. So IndianLiberals.in, I think it is, the website, has all these wonderful writings of classical liberal libertarian writers writing not only in English but in Hindi and Malayalam and other Indian languages to show that this is part of their tradition as well. It's not some foreign import from a Russian Ayn Rand or an Austrian Friedrich Hayek or other people, or a Scotsman Adam Smith. These are also Indian ideas, that they have roots in Indian soil. So I'm very optimistic, and I never cease to be impressed by the SFL leaders that I meet at their various conferences and events. I'm not a scholar of Indian civilization, so I should be a little cautious, but there are some elements that I think you can get out of the Vedic texts and out of Indian tradition that are worth mentioning. There's a very good book by Gurcharan Das on the difficulty of being good. And he draws from the Vedic texts, from Mahabharata and other texts, and applies moral insights to contemporary problems and issues in business and politics that he's faced in his life as a business person and a writer in India. That was a very wonderful book. I really loved that book. One of the things that comes out is the role of self-control and of attempting to reach Dharma, which you might translate as virtue, the good behavior, the knowing how to do the right thing in the right circumstances. And that dharmic tradition, I think, is very important. It's like virtue ethics in the West, but with some different nuances. There's a story in the Mahabharata of a king who is very angry, and he sees a lizard, and he remembers he had been bitten as a child. He's angry and he wants to smash it. And the lizard turns around and says, Ahimsa parama, pardon my bad pronunciation, Ahimsa paramo dharma. Nonviolence is the highest dharma. And I thought, wow, a liberty lizard. It's just so powerful. This idea that to be nonviolent is a great virtue and to be controlled. So I think that's an element that is about controlling impulses to violence. And then finally, the notion, which, to paint with a very broad brush, you might find in a multitude of religious traditions from the area, of self-control, articulated by different sages and religious leaders and philosophers, to control oneself. And I think that's at the core of libertarianism in a psychological understanding, to have self-control. So I think that those themes are deeply rooted in the civilization and the context of South Asia. And it's good to see them coming to the fore with Asian libertarianism. One could say similar things about Chinese libertarianism, the role of Lao Tzu and Taoist thought, but also elements of Neo-Confucianism about respect for others, about having the right behavior and so on, has as well a libertarian interpretation. Not the only one, right? The statists and advocates of authoritarianism have their interpretation as well. But there is a strong libertarian tradition of that. And then we could see that in other traditions, in Islam, for example, the libertarian roots there's violent interpretations. We see this with ISIS and other horrible groups. But there are also people who draw from that tradition respect for one another, for not having compulsion in matters of religion. And so in each case, connecting the libertarian ideas we all share with their own roots in every civilization, I think, is absolutely crucial for the success of the libertarian project that Students for Liberty is advancing. I think the most underrated concept is the one that's underrated because it's hard to make it seem sexy, and that's the rule of law. The rule of law is so important, and it's something I came to appreciate not only from reading books by Hayek and the like, but from my experience in countries that didn't have it, how important it is. I remember back early 1980s in Germany, I saw in the cinema a movie by some communist Marxist director, and they make fun of the concept. And there's an image of an old man speaking in German about the Rechtsstaat, the law-governed state. And he says the law-governed state is a great achievement. And it's presented as a kind of ridicule, something to laugh at, just very uncool, as opposed to socialism and communist revolution and so on. And I remember watching that and thinking, at that time, he was a very old man. It looked like he was 90s or something, and stammering a bit. But I thought, that man lived through some terrible, terrible things, and he knows what he's talking about. The achievement of the rule of law is a great accomplishment. But it doesn't sound sexy. It's hard to explain how important it is. It makes you sound boring to say rules matter. Rules are important. You need to have good rules and then follow them. It doesn't sound bold. You can't imagine Che Guevara saying that. And so it's hard to express to people how deeply important it is to have a system in which you know what the rules are reasonable, they're simple, everyone can understand them. As Richard Epstein titled his book, Simple Rules for a Complex World. And then follow them and internalize them. That's how you avoid dictatorship. when people don't need a policeman to beat them on the head, because people know what generally is the right thing to do and they follow it. And that's only possible when the rules are simple. When they're complicated and page after page, like the Brazilian Constitution, is a huge thing, right? No one knows what's in it. You need to have something that's simple, people can understand. And that is a sine qua non, that without which not, for liberty, is the rule of law. The challenge, and I've struggled with this for a long time, is how to make that something that moves the heart, that really makes you say, I want to fight for the rule of law, and not sound like a really old grandmother or grandfather. That's, I think, the challenge that we face. I think an opinion that I have that might be unpopular with some libertarians is the importance of choosing your battles and picking issues where you can make a difference, make the world more peaceful, more free. I don't believe in lying about what I believe. I don't recommend that. Lying is a bad thing to do normally. So if people ask me my views on something, I'll tell them. But there are some issues that are peripheral, and there's a kind of personality that's attracted to them because they shock people. They like that. They become involved in a political movement to scare their parents or shock their grandparents. And so they'll pick these very peripheral things and say, what about that? What about that? And I think that's a mistake. It's not to say that we shouldn't always move the margins. So talking about gay marriage equality or something, or LGBTQ rights or something 40 years ago, people are, oh. But it was important to do that. But to do it in a reasonable way, to do it in a way to try to convince people to change their opinion on these matters, and not to shock them, not to scare them off somehow. So I think we need to, on the one hand, maintain our integrity, and on the other hand, choose our battles and try to pick those areas where we can win. I was in Iraq quite a few years ago and speaking at a conference, and a lady came up to me, and she looked very like a Salafist, a very old-fashioned believer, extreme believer in Islam. And she said, we don't want this liberalism, we don't want this democracy where a man marries a man and a woman marries a woman. This was before this was the case in many countries. And I said, well, that's probably not going to happen anytime soon in Iraq. I don't know that's a defining characteristic of democracy as such. But I was a little surprised. Two other ladies, also dressed with the long gloves and outwardly looking Salafist. But it reminded me, don't judge a book exclusively by its cover. They said to her, what does it matter to you? Live your own life. You have a husband and family. Be happy. Don't worry what the other people are doing in their home. Which really surprised me. There's a libertarian view coming from what you might not have expected just from external appearances. But these ladies, they had the liberty spirit in their hearts. It's not an issue I would have picked as the wedge issue in that part of the world. But it's one that you shouldn't lie about. But it's not the one that I would have put forward as what it means to be a liberal in that context. There were other issues of religious freedom that were more at the forefront. So picking your battles, and sometimes reasonable people will disagree on what's the most important issue. And we have to recognize also that even though I might have a strong opinion on something and make a commitment, it doesn't mean the other people are wicked or wrong if they disagree with me. So I think picking your battles, and that sometimes means disagreeing with friends with whom you share so much in common, because you have to make choices in life. I think reading a few books when I was very young made a big difference for my life, and I could trace lots of things back to that. And that was Frederick Bastiat. He's my hero. And when he explains in what is seen and what is not seen, what we call in economics opportunity costs. Every choice has a cost, something you give up. In normal personal behavior, people understand that. When it comes to social or collective choice, they don't. All they see is the benefit and they don't see the cost because it's diffused over large numbers of people or hidden in some way. And Bastiat said we should make the real cost apparent to people so we can have rational policies and rational discussion. Once you get that, the world doesn't look the same. Once you understand that choices have costs, you might still be a socialist, but you won't be an unreflective, dumb socialist. You'll at least be a bit more thoughtful about it. So economics, understood in that way, is a kind of natural segue to liberalism. Not inherent, or not inevitable, but it's compatible with the liberal mentality. And I think economics is very important for me and was the way I came to these ideas rather than through readings on natural rights or other related questions. So I think that's important. The second that I've been spending more time on lately is empirical psychology, because I think that's the area that needs to be explored the most for insights about liberty. I'm not against economics. I love economics. I'm happy to see people go on and write books and get doctorates and all those great things. But I think that psychology is the area that we should be spending more time on and promoting more research, because it's full of insights relevant to the possibility of voluntary cooperation among large numbers of people not known to each other, not bound by love or family or kinship, and how to promote voluntary cooperation and avoid tribalism, which I think is a big threat in the world right now, is the reemergence of ideological tribalism that has psychological roots. If we want to combat that, we need to understand the psychology of tribalism, and on the other hand, the psychology of freedom and responsibility. It's very important for someone who says you should keep an open mind to be able to say, well, I changed my mind about something. If you had the same opinions on everything since you were 15, that's pretty strong evidence you don't have an open mind. People change their views. One in the distant past that I talked about was understanding the importance of the rule of law. And that's the thing, I continue to grow in appreciation of it. I remember hearing people years ago in libertarian circles say, oh, black markets are great. A black market just is a free market. That's wrong. It's simply wrong. Black markets are terrible. They are what you have when you don't get a free market. And they're dangerous places, ungoverned by law, typically governed by predatory behavior and violence. Or people say, oh, it's great when you can just bribe your way out of a problem. Loopholes in the law gives that person who can get through more freedom. So shouldn't we want lots of loopholes? No. That creates a society of predatory behavior on the part of those who can open or close the loopholes for you or charge a fee to get through it. I'd much rather have a society in which the rules are pretty simple, they apply to everyone, and everyone follows them, rather than one with complex behavior that generates arbitrariness, predatory activities, but some can get through and others cannot. So that notion of rule-governed behavior, I think, is important. And let me lead to an area where it kind of bites a little bit. People say, oh, it's great to smuggle and avoid taxation and so on. So yeah, okay, I understand. If these are unjust things and you can escape it, that's okay. But I don't think that's the same as achieving freedom. Achieving freedom is changing the rules to be more fair, more just, more in accordance with our liberty, rather than thinking, oh, I'm so clever because I got around it, and therefore I'm experiencing freedom. You might have escaped something terrible, but you're not creating a free society in doing that. You're just perpetuating it. What we need to do is change the rules so everyone has equal freedom. There's a topic I've written on and expressed strong views, but my real views are not as strong as the ones I expressed, and that's intellectual property. I'm not convinced that this is a natural outgrowth of our natural rights, that we have a perpetual right or even a time-limited right to exclusive use of an idea. And I'm not convinced by all the utilitarian arguments, which are usually way overblown. But I do worry that moving to a regime with no intellectual property rights could have some negative consequences, particularly in pharmaceuticals, which are fairly easy to reverse engineer. If you just run through a chemical analysis of what's in the pill, and then you can reproduce it. The marginal cost is very low because you didn't have all of that overhead and research. And it could be that we would suffer a drying up of new pharmaceutical compounds and cures. So that's something that makes me hesitant about just saying just abolish it all. It's a utilitarian concern, but when it comes to saving lives, I think it has weight, and I don't just dismiss it. Finally, I'm not convinced by those who say, oh, every country should adopt the same intellectual property standards as the US or Britain or something. It's just crazy, the idea that that's what's going to boost economic growth and prosperity in Tanzania or some places is not plausible. On the other hand, it is a pretty good proxy for the rule of law generally, that they do enforce those things. And then finally, related to that, there are companies that crank out fake products in China and Russia and other countries that are flooded into usually low-income countries, and they kill people. It's a monstrous crime. And if you had a young child and you get a pill at the store and it's not correct, it's either toxic or just a placebo, and your child dies, that's homicide. What we need then is to have regimes that can enforce the trademark at a minimum for those products so people get what they think they're getting when they pay for it. And that might mean government activity. I'm not against the government per se. I'm against coercion. I'm against the society of violence. But I think government has a legitimate role, and this is one of those, is to make sure that if it says it's a Glaxo Wellcome pharmaceutical product, that's what it is, and not something from some illegal factory someplace that causes you to have a bad reaction or no positive benefit from it. And those are areas where certain kinds of intellectual property protection need to be boosted, and I think that's worthwhile activity. So I'm not entirely convinced we should get rid of them. I'm skeptical of the case, but I can see some arguments for additional enforcement of intellectual property rights, and I don't dismiss those. Think about the most absurd government imposition. There are so many, and there are people who have done these compilations of crazy things. It's illegal to walk an alligator on a leash and things like that are silly and absurd. But there's something behind these. Sometimes, of course, just special interest behavior, but also mentality that if we didn't tell people what to do, they wouldn't know what to do. And it reminds me of a moment when I saw the root in the mind of these inabilities to understand human behavior and order without commands. Many, many years ago, I might have been 17 or something, I gave a talk in front of a high school audience about libertarian ideas. And there was a young woman there, one of the students, and she had a very hard question. And when I called on her, she leaned in like a cat. You could see her ears kind of flattening back. She was going to get me. She said, "Do you think the government should issue birth certificates?" I thought, I'd never thought of that question, right? It's not the sort of thing you think about a lot. And I didn't have a birth certificate myself. My parents had passed away, and I don't know if there was one, so I don't have one. And I thought about it, and I said, well, in the absence of some obvious reason for it, I don't see why that should be a governmental activity, and churches and hospitals have issued those in the past. And then she knew she had me. She leaned forward and she said, how would you know who you are? And I thought, wow, she couldn't imagine having a personal identity unless it was delivered to her by the government. Even personal identity was something delivered to you. And I thought, there's a very deep root of statism there that she had been raised to believe, or had concluded for some reason, that you can't have a personal identity unless the state gives it to you. And I just thought that was so weird. But the more I thought about it, I said, that's it. That's really the problem. Many people can't understand the possibility of social cooperation without orders, without a boss, without some monopoly telling you what to do. And at some deep level, that's what we have to combat. And so that's, I think, the root of lots of these crazy, idiotic rules and regulations. And the world is just full of them. You could fill libraries with them. But fundamentally, many people can't imagine people running their own lives or even having a personal identity without the state telling them. I think something I've learned, and it's an accumulation of experience, but maybe something I'd share with people who are 25 now or younger, is to try not to be angry. And so much of the time I was angry about injustice and violence and war. And I think anger is a useful emotion. Sometimes we should be angry. It moves us to do something. It can give us more courage sometimes. But being angry all the time is unhealthy. It's not good for you, and it's not compatible with the libertarian spirit, in my opinion, psychologically. It's not a logical incompatibility, but I think there's a psychological incompatibility. And try to learn to be calmer. This has been a big process for me in my life. Try to become a calm person. It's not easy. Some people think, oh, naturally calm person, naturally agitated person. There may be predispositions to that, but you can learn to become more calm. And I think that has been better for me, and I think it's been better for me as a libertarian activist to try to become more of a calm person, and even when there are injustices around me, to be angry about them in the right way, not to be indifferent. That's not what I propose. But not to be consumed by anger when you see things that you think are wrong. And even more importantly, not to be angry when you think people are wrong, when you think they have a conviction, a view, a belief that you believe is false. Don't be angry with them. And that took me more time to appreciate. Sometimes I still struggle with it.